Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Tales from the Road, Volume 14, Story Number 1. This is an old legend I heard from my scoutmaster who had lived a long and exciting life. It's an old but favorite campfire tale, a legend I've only partly been able to verify. This is how I heard it, with only a few storytelling embellishments. The little factual information I've gleaned will come at the end. Mr. J, the scoutmaster, claimed he was aboard a battleship in Pearl Harbor, Arizona, I think, and survived by climbing out the smokestack. As he would put it, every so often someone would ask him if that was the strangest thing that ever happened to him. As we sat around a campfire, I remember a strange look in his eyes, and he answered, no. And then he'd tell us the tale of Fog City. Long ago, he said, he'd been working with a lumber company exploring the mountains. His job was to report on pure stands, so they could log them. He traveled with a partner because traveling alone was a good way to die. Even so, it was lonely work, and so when they met the Mexican shepherds, they readily agreed to set camp with them for the night. As night began to fall, however, Mr. J noticed the animals were getting restless. His friend saw it too. The Mexicans seemed very nervous, and as they spoke in Spanish, they suddenly started to break down camp. One came to them and said, "We have to move, right now, please." Despite the fact that it was almost dark and building camp isn't easy, they agreed, if only to humor them. But as they settled in for the second time, Mr. J turned to them and asked, "All right, what was it about that place? Why did we have to move?" They stared uncomfortably at each other for a moment, then one spoke. "Behold, even the animals can sense the evil of that place." And with that he told them the tale of Fog City. If the town had a real name, it's been lost to time. Even the ghosts call it Fog City now. But back then it was a small mining town nestled in the Washington Mountains. More exactly, it was two towns. The mine itself on the top of the hill where the miners lived 6 days out of the week. Down below was the town proper, which had things like the general store, the jail, and of course the only bar. Every weekend the miners would descend with their pay ready to pitch a liberty. Now, legend says that the bartender was a good sort. To help miners from overspending, he would hold their money for them and make sure they never overspent in his bar. This made him into the town's unofficial banker, as well as bartender, and he was very well liked by most. No one has much information on the three strangers who wandered in. Everyone thought they were just miners, hard on their luck. The truth was worse. One of them had realized that a bar could never be as secure as a bank, and so they made a plan. Soon after the bartender and town drunk got into one of their famous arguments, they struck. That night they broke in and killed the bartender, robbed the place, and left more evidence to frame the town drunk. To further throw off suspicion, they hid the money in case they were searched. Their plan worked. The next day the town drunk was arrested, tried, and set for execution. As they took him out to the hanging tree, strung him up, they asked him for some last words. A strange look came into his eyes. Some say it was a final moment of sobriety, but others were unnerved by his calm. "I tell you again, I did not do this. But the guilty ones will pay." He pointed a finger. "See that crack in the mountains? When the criminals come, the fog will roll in, and justice will be seen." They hung him, of course. Who listens to a drunk? After the trial, the men calmly packed up and headed out of town. By some odd coincidence, not far from which Mr. J would try to camp many years later. That night, two of them stayed back, while the third one went back into the town to retrieve the loot. As they watched the crack in the mountains, the fog came slowly rolling in. That man was never heard from again. The other two were sure he'd simply run with the money, but a new check showed it was untouched. The only oddity was on the hanging tree. Instead of one fresh rope burned from the hanging the day before, there were two. The men were even more frightened, and so that night one of them snuck back into town. The last man, as he stood there, saw the fog start to roll in. Needless to say, the second man was never seen again. At this, the third man panicked and fled. The story emerged sometime later in a bar in Seattle, some drunk ranting about treasure in Fog City. But to this day, no one dares seek the treasure. Others have tried, and the few who returned only had one thing to say: the fog came rolling in. Okay, now for the less prosaic version. I've heard this story for years, but I've never been able to verify much of it. Mr. J said he had been to the place where Fog City was. It was accessible by dirt road, possibly to this day. I can't say. He took a bunch of scouts there once. Some of them confirmed that much, but they said they saw the fog rolling in and decided to run. What I do know is this: Mr. J put the location of Fog City in the Cascades. More specifically, he put it as not far from Crystal Mountain Ski Resort, and on the western side of a small mountain route called Scout Pass, which is enough to pin it into the South Cascades. To further confirm that there's something to this tale, there's even a very small hiking trail called Fog City. That's enough to nail down the approximate area. Sadly, that's all I can find. Maybe you'll be luckier. Story number 2. Well, I'm not telling this story through my eyes. This story is a tale from my oldest brother, a tale from his childhood. See, we were from a small town in Texas, about 30 minutes from Victoria. This town has a very creepy and haunted past. Well, when I was about 13, my stepfather would take us hunting on his family's land. Out there is where he took us to get away from hardships of life and teach us to be men. Me being the oldest of 5 at the time, I've always had an eye for the supernatural. This was my most terrifying encounter. Well, here it goes. One autumn, my stepfather took us to the country to check on traps and wildlife. Me being the oldest, I was checking on a hog trap and wandered off further on the land than I'd ever been to before. However, I'd been all over this property and knew my way back to where my stepfather parked, and found myself in a very unfamiliar area. I knew there was a fence around the land, and yet I hadn't seen the fence yet. I kept wondering, being a curious preteen. I walked up to a tree with a cow skull seeming strategically placed at the base of the tree. Me being very artsy and creative, my mind told me I could make something very artistic with this awesome looking cow skull. So I picked up the skull of a cow and took it back to where my stepfather and siblings were. When I got there, I found a very annoyed and angry stepfather and siblings, not realizing that I had wandered for hours. I guess I'd been gone longer than I knew. It only seemed like it wasn't more than half an hour I'd been gone. So I jumped in the truck and tried to explain what I did and where I'd been, only to be cut off by my stepfather scolding me. Do you know how irresponsible that was? Do you know there are wild hogs and bobcats and coyotes? What if you would have been in danger? I had no way of finding you. You could have been killed. But I tried to input what I had discovered, but it was shrugged off with how bad the situation could have been. At the time, it seemed so stupid of a reason to be angry. So I shut my mouth and rode back the whole 20 minutes, home being lectured about my lack of responsibility. Seeing how this was a school night and it was very late, much later than I'd hoped, I took the cow skull inside to my room and threw it on the top shelf in my closet. I took a bath and laid down. The clock showed, when I was done, 12:31, so I climbed in bed thinking about how I could have been gone for so long when it felt only like several minutes. So I thought, oh well, what the hell, and I started nodding off. Once I was in a good sleep, at least I thought, I heard rustling inside my closet. I thought to myself, seeing how this is a country, maybe it's a field mouse coming in from the cold. So I rolled over with my face towards the walk, and when I do, I feel as if someone's watching me. That can't be. I always feel when something not normal is around, and this feeling was growing and growing until I heard my name. Will, the creepy voice in a man's voice called to me. Terrified and hoping this is a prank by my older sister, slowly turned around and to my surprise, I see a body midway out of my closet. It's not a familiar size. It seemed to be standing about 6 feet 2 inches or more, dressed in Civil War clothes, and the head is the cow skull I had found, and its eyes are glowing green. And I see it beckoning to me to follow it. My heart sank into my socks, it seemed. I screamed for my mother and stepfather as loud as I could, and the thing came completely out of the closet, same come with it, as it seemed as it was going to come and carry me away. I jumped up and ran to the door down the hall to my parents' room to wake my mom and a half-dressed stepfather loading a shotgun. I told him, it's in my room, and he sprints to my room and I follow right behind him. My stepfather flips on the light, looks around my room to find nothing. We open the closet door and the cow skull is on the top shelf where I had left it. I told him the story and he said, "Son, I know you can see things, but this is too far. Take that skull outside. Why do you even have it inside?" After just witnessing the fear of a lifetime from that damn skull, I'm thinking, well, that might work. So I put on my shoes and I take the skull outside with the assistance of my mother. I felt an eerie feeling as I walked away. Too afraid to look back, I caught up with my mom, walking into the house through the back door. She asked, did I know the time? I could have woken everyone. It's 12:32. Wait, it's what time? I know my clock was running, and I know it should have been way longer than the time that I saw the cow thing. And now, oh my God, I'm losing my mind. Okay, I guess I'll try to get some sleep. So I went back, laid in my bed, and my mind's still on alert because I know what I saw, and that image will be stuck in my head forever. Started trying to make sense of it all, but I can't wrap my mind around a tall man with a cow's head. And I see a green light begin to glow inside my closet. I sat up thinking, not again. I heard my name being called, and the closet doorknob slowly jiggles and turns. I bolted to my parents' room once again. My stepdad isn't too happy. I can tell at this point. He turns on my light only to find, you guessed it, the skull back again. He looked at me as if I'd snuck it back behind my mother's back. But I couldn't confirm this with her. Wait, am I actually going crazy? I know I put it out because I was afraid to turn around in the backyard. This time my stepfather came with me. I felt very uncomfortable in my own skin, and me being my age, I asked something I'd never thought I would at my age. Can I sleep in your room tonight? I asked my stepfather. He pauses, cause the question caught him off guard, I suppose. Sure, I guess. Rejoice, I grabbed the cover, left the lights on, of course, and all day at school I tried to wrap my head around what I'd witnessed the night before. So let's just say I wasn't much interested in what went on in school that day, and I was withdrawn trying to think about it all. From the time warp to the skull back inside the house after I put it out, one thing about not wanting to be home, the school day flies by quick, and so does the day. So after lunch, I asked if I could use the restroom at homeroom. I grabbed the pass and went to the restroom, my mind still full. I did my business, washed my hands. As I looked in the mirror, I see old-fashioned boots in the stall directly behind me, and all three stall doors opened at once. I screamed. I mean, like a woman singing her heart out, and the thing touched me. I was ice cold at this point. I realize it's no longer asking me to see what it wants to show me, but takes me, so I run down the hall, past the classroom where the main rule is no running, but this is the exception. So I get back to class and it's 12:31. Okay, all that part about the restroom I made up about my brother's encounter. But if this goes to movie, let's keep that part. Anyway, back to the story. When I get home, I inspect my closet and see the skull is still outside. No one asks about the night before, so maybe they all think I'm insane because I know I sure feel that way. I stayed inside all day, and when it came time for bed, I headed toward my parents' room, only to be rejected back to mine. Sigh. What if the skull is back? What if I get taken? So no one cares, I see. But I fell asleep about 10 that night, yet once again I heard my name. Only this time it's from my window. In fear, I laid there trying not to look. I finally hear this tapping. I put my pillow over my head. I feel a very ice cold touch to my elbow, and when I remove the pillow, I see the thing's hand passing through the glass, touching my arm. I went into complete panic. Yet it seems it still wants me to see something. I'm not the one for showmanship, so once again, I bolted for my parents' room. This went on for 2 more nights, until my stepfather had enough and took me back to the country, and I hung the skull on the fence. Later that night, it was back again, and it came from my closet, and I escaped once again. So my stepfather took me out once again. This time it was in the middle of the night. I grabbed the skull, and it seemed to be pulling me this time. My stepfather followed with a shotgun and a shovel as I was guided through the wood via the cow skull. Finally, we arrived at the very tree I found the skull at, and I saw him, and his voice said to dig. I told my stepfather to dig, and commanded as the voice did, and I guess he could never hear it, but I did. Finally, he said, "Stop it now, boy, you're scaring the shit out of me." And it was about to rain, so my stepfather said, "Out that damn skull in the hole and let's go." The storm got pretty bad, and my stepfather allowed me to sleep on the floor in their room that night. The next night, and from then on, I never heard or saw the cow skull man again. Hopefully, that's a good thing. Now that I'm in my mid 50s, I often wondered what it was he wanted to show me. Next story. I'd known Carl for a very long time. It was a rare treat to both find ourselves in London with enough time on our hands to share a drink and a long chat. Carl lived in the South London borough of Greenwich. As the owner of a successful property development company, he had done quite well for himself. In his younger years, he had the foresight to buy a house as soon as he left university. In those days, property prices in London were quite reasonable, and through a series of purchases, he'd built up a lucrative portfolio as his property significantly increased in value. He had become quite wealthy. I, on the other hand, decided that I wanted to be an artist, spending the next 6 years studying art in London and Paris, and spent most of my life working as a freelance artist and illustrator. I do all right for myself, but I've always felt a little envious of Carl's lifestyle. As we grew up, we managed to straddle the two polarities of creative freedom and fiscal responsibility, sharing many nights out, incinerating candles at both ends over and over again. We would meet occasionally as we'd grown older, but our lives had taken different paths and inevitably we'd seen less of each other. But every time we met, it was like we'd never been apart. The evening we decided to meet at his house, a luxurious apartment in a converted hospital building on Shooter's Hill. I wasn't in the mood for our usual drinking session in the pubs and bars of Greenwich or Blackheath Village. We were both tired, and it was a rare thing for Carl to have his house free. Carl was married with 2 children who were visiting family in Kent for the weekend. We ordered takeaway, sat in his living room, and watched a Korean ghost movie, drinking beer, laughing at each other's jokes, and reminiscing. Carl was a bit of a horror film buff. Back in the old days, he insisted on playing a horror film whenever we got home from a night out. We'd watch some awful shit. When the film finished, Carl fetched a bottle of single malt scotch from the kitchen with 2 glasses. "Don't even think about asking for ice," he said, as he placed the glasses down on the coffee table and poured 2 generous measures. We started talking about the film. It was a good one. I can't remember the name, something to do with a haunted squadron during the Korean War. I asked him if he'd ever made it to Korea when he lived in Japan many years ago. "Nah," he replied. "I wanted to go. Could have done it as it was only a short ferry ride from where I lived." Carl had spent a year traveling through Asia during his gap year. Part of his adventure involved teaching English in Japan. "Whereabouts in Japan were you?" I asked. "Fukuoka." No one really knows much about Fukuoka, but it was a pretty cool place to live. There's a high-speed ferry service to South Korea, but I had a Japanese work visa. If I left the country, it would have created a visa problem. I would have lost my job. Carl looked into the glass of whiskey in his hand. Yeah, it was good. Good times. Carl stopped talking, continuing to look into his glass. I assumed he was about to tell me another one of his crazy stories. For a single year in Japan, he seemed to cram in a hell of a lot of fun. The sound of traffic going past his apartment drifted in through an open window. I've never told anyone about this, but something really weird happened when I was over there, he said. Which one? You've told me so many stories, I can't keep track. Carl smiled. No, not those experiences. No, it was something else that happened. Something weird. Weirder than some of the shit you've already told me? That would have to be properly weird, I laughed. Carl was oddly serious when he said, Do you believe in ghosts? It was a question out of the blue. Neither of us had ever really talked about ghosts in any real sense. Watched plenty of horror movies, but never really spoke about any paranormal experiences of our own. I was surprised as much by the gravity in his voice as the sudden change in direction of the conversation. Do I believe in ghosts? I repeated the question. Belief is a strong word, I eventually replied. I guess I can reckon they might exist. Not like in the films, though. I don't think ghosts are like that. Carl paused again. I think you might be right. Ghosts are everywhere. It struck me that this was an odd thing to say. Before I had time to respond, Carl poured another couple of shots of whiskey into our glasses and began to tell his tale. Like I've told you before, Japan was an incredible experience. I taught in kindergartens and schools all over Fukuoka, Prefecture on Kyushu. I know I've never really talked about this, but before I go any further, you need to know something. I've always been open to the idea of ghosts, spirits, or being, or whatever you want to call them. From a very young age, I always felt that there was something beyond what we know, see, and feel, another layer to our existential perception of being. I was a little surprised. In all the years I'd known Carl, I'd never heard him talk about his spiritual side. And you saw ghosts in Japan? I said. Carl sat forward in his seat. Saw? No, I didn't see a ghost. I felt it though. Throughout my life, I've had several experiences of something other than what we could loosely describe as the physical existence. If this sounds vague, it's because I'm not entirely sure what I'm talking about. You're talking about ghosts, I said. Not exactly. I don't really know if ghosts are what I'd call my experiences. I've come across feelings, anything from simple intuition through to physical contact. Physical contact? Like Pete Venkman in Ghostbusters, I joked. Carl ignored my remark and continued. If you've never been to Japan, you must go. It's a place of spirits. There are shrines everywhere. Ordinary folk live with the spirits, the kami, who are like essences of gods. They inhabit everything. The line between the living world and the spiritual world often feels as though it's less definite in Japan. I decided to keep my mouth shut and let Carl talk. His stories were always good. Took another sip of the single malt. When I took the teaching job, I was provided with accommodation, an apartment in Hakata, which is more or less the central business district in the city of Fukuoka. In many ways, it's the least interesting part of the city, mostly apartment buildings and soulless office blocks. Nothing architecturally or culturally significant. Most apartment buildings in Japan are similar, about 10 to 15 stories, modern, well maintained, and completely unremarkable. These apartments are aimed at single salarymen who in some cases live hundreds of miles away from their families in cities all over Japan. My apartment was similarly unspectacular. It was the seventh floor. It can be politely described as compact. It was effectively a long single room with a sliding dividing wall which could be drawn across to separate one end of the room from the other. At one end was a small lobby where shoes were removed before entering, a toilet with heated toilet seat, a small bathroom, and kitchenette. The other end of the apartment was where I had my bed and the patio doors open up to a balcony overlooking the main road. I have to admit, I wondered why he was telling me about the detailed layout of his Japanese apartment. Carl stood up and stretched. He turned towards the window and spent a couple of seconds looking at the dark panes. The darkness outside reflected the light of the room inwards. It had started to rain outside. He picked up his glass and took a large gulp of whiskey. I had lived in Japan for about 6 months when something quite strange and utterly terrifying happened. By then, I'd pretty much settled into Japanese life. The life of an English teacher abroad isn't particularly glamorous. Most of my lessons were in after school clubs. I was either working, sitting in a train, drinking in the local bar with other teachers and the locals. At weekends, I explored as much of Japan as time would permit. For the most part, I used to finish my work and then cycle back to my block from the train station, maybe pick up a meal and some beers from the 7-Eleven, take the elevator to the apartment and crash in front of my laptop watching a TV stream from back home in England. Carl stood in the center of his living room, glass in hand, t-shirt hanging around his waist. What had started off as a fairly innocuous conversation had quickly acquired a newer presence. It hung in the air between us. I've never told anyone about this, to be honest. I'm struggling to put this into words, so you'll have to bear with me. I nodded and told him to take his time. I think the first time it happened was after I had fallen asleep on my bed. Carl continued. It was late, early morning. It was hot. The summers in Japan are unspeakably hot. The air conditioning was on, and I was out of it probably after drinking a few beers. I remember I woke suddenly. I guess I was dehydrated, but I was acutely aware that something in the apartment had changed. I remember a feeling of dread, a weird gut sense of impending danger. A kind of anxiousness came completely out of the blue all at once and out of nothing. Carl turned to look at me. I realized it was the first time our eyes had met since he started telling me his story. I felt, he said, I felt as if someone was there, as though someone was in the apartment with me. I knew that the feeling made no sense. I knew I was alone, but it was like... Carl trailed off. He was genuinely struggling to find the words. I was just about to tell him that he didn't have to tell me his story if he didn't want to, when he continued. At first, I lay there, listening in the semi-darkness with only the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. The sliding wall was drawn halfway across the apartment, so the light from the computer screen lit the door, but beyond it was just blackness. I was sure there was someone out there in the darkness. I should have been able to dismiss this thought as imagination or the remnants of an alcoholic-induced dead sleep, were it not for the pervasive and very real sense that it was real. There was something really there. As quietly as I could, I slid out of bed, slowly reached out, and got ready to pull the screen back as fast as I could. At this point, I was in attack mode. My heart was racing. I pulled the screen across so hard it made a loud bang as it hit the end of the rollers. Carl stopped. The rain outside had started falling more heavily. It sounded like a storm was brewing. Well, I said, what was it? Nothing. Carl looked at me gently, shaking his head. Just my empty apartment. I could see the front door from where I stood. I checked that it was locked, which it was. There was nothing there. Nothing. So it was a dream, I said? Maybe you were having a nightmare and when you woke up you just got confused. Carl nodded. That's more or less what I put it down to. But as much as I told myself there was nothing there, I just couldn't shake the feeling I had. The feeling in the apartment had changed somehow. It felt different somehow. Different? How? Carl thought for a moment. You know when you walk into a building and it has a feeling and atmosphere? I nodded. It was like the place acquired a new personality. I don't think I slept particularly well for a few nights. I often woke up, but I didn't experience that sensation of another presence. I put it down as a one-off anomaly. Perhaps, I thought, living alone was starting to affect me. Maybe I was homesick. Maybe drunk. There could have been 100 reasons, yet I'd never known that sense of presence before. At the time, the experience played on my mind. I looked at Carl. He was now sitting leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees, his right arm extended with his hand holding his glass before him. So it was a weird experience. So what? To be honest, mate, I've had weird feelings. It's just one of those things. I'd have liked to have said that and gotten the experience off his chest, which is what I thought he was trying to do. But then I noticed his demeanor. Carl looked tense. And then it happened again, he said. But the next time it happened, I was laying awake in bed. It was night and watching a TV show on my laptop. I was fully awake and fully aware. As I lay on my bed, I again began to get that same feeling of intense dread. A chill ran through my body. That feeling that someone was in the apartment. It was so real that I called out, "Hello," to the room. Then something really weird started to happen. I started to feel pressure on my neck, the lower part of my throat. It became quite uncomfortable. I coughed. I rubbed the part of my throat just here. Carl pointed to the spot on his neck, just below his Adam's apple. Then the pressure was real. It was real. I was being choked. Choked? I said. What, like being strangled? Carl nodded. I took a moment to take this in. There was no doubt that Carl meant what he said. That moment, I looked at my friend, successful business owner, family man, now in his middle age, reliving something that happened over 20 years ago. I don't think I've ever seen him like this. As he was telling his story, he put his hands up to his throat and rubbed his neck. "So what did you do?" I asked. I freaked out, big time. I shook myself. I stood up waving my arms around. I threw open the sliding door. I shouted into the empty space. There was nothing there. Again, Carl paused as if to collect his thoughts. "Wait," I said. "You're being strangled by a what? By a ghost?" Carl sat looking into the bottom of his empty glass. "I don't know. To this day I still wonder about it, what it could have been. I don't mind telling you I was terrified. Someone or something had put its hands around my throat. I switched on every light. There was of course nothing there to be seen." "That's really strange," I said. "What did you do? Is that why you left Japan?" "No, well, not entirely, to be honest. I didn't know what to do. My experience that evening shook me. But even at that stage I realized that I might have been dealing with something from the other." "The other?" I replied. "Look, as I said earlier, I've always been open to the spiritual and decided to treat the experience as that. It could have been in my head, but my feeling was that it wasn't. To be frank, I had very little choice. I was halfway through my teaching contract, and it wasn't like I could just up sticks and move to another apartment. Whenever I came home from work, I would politely say hello, explain to the room what I had done all day, speaking to it as if it were a person. I even learned some Japanese phrases just in case whatever it was couldn't speak English. I don't know if any of this worked, but it did help me. There wasn't a repeat of the strangling episode. For a while, anyway." "It happened again?" I asked. Carl nodded. "This time I was half asleep, and this time I definitely felt two hands wrapping around my neck, thumbs pushing into my windpipe. I awoke literally choking. I panicked, thrashing around wildly, trying to fight off whatever it was that was attacking me. I shouted. I screamed. This time, though, I was furious. I went into attack mode. I shouted, 'Who are you?' over and over again. But there was nothing, just the silence. I think I was more angry than scared this time, and it was only much later when I began to think about what had happened that I started to worry. Something just did not want me in that apartment. I don't know why, nor did I care." Carl stopped talking. We both sat in silence. I tried to visualize what he had experienced. Carl had never spoken of any other paranormal experience like this before. For Carl, we lived among spirits. He often said that ghosts were everywhere. He was dismissive of most TV paranormal investigators. They were all charlatans, in his opinion. Carl reached for the whiskey bottle. I couldn't be sure, but for a moment I thought that I saw his hand shaking a little. It was clear that in telling me this tale, he was reliving every moment. I decided to play devil's advocate. "Okay, so, other than some kind of spirit, what else could it have been? Perhaps you were just living alone too long? Perhaps—" "No," Carl interrupted me, while pouring us another large measure of scotch. "Listen, I've been through the options. I thought about everything. Everything you're saying has been considered. I will never forget that feeling of a presence. There was something there. I couldn't see it, but it was definitely there. I decided the best thing to do would be to simply accept what he was saying. I think that's what Carl was looking for. Acceptance. Eventually, events back home in England caught up with me. My mother was ill, I was homesick, and the weird shit in my apartment was freaking me. I didn't really want to spend too much time in the apartment anyway. I quit my job and booked a flight to Thailand, where I planned to pick up a connecting flight back to London. Although there wasn't another incident in the apartment, 2 nights before the flight, I moved my luggage to a locker in Hakata Station and spent the remainder of my time in Japan in a 24-hour internet place and a room in a cheap hotel. I've never experienced anything like that, what I experienced in Japan, ever again. Even now, as I remember the incident, I remember the feeling of pressure around my throat and it sends chills all over my body. We sat there both deep in thought. The rain had stopped and the sound of traffic passing on the wet road punctuated the silence. I thought about the presence in that apartment, that feeling Thou spoke about, the other person in the room. Have you ever felt that presence again? Carl thought for a moment. No, not that presence. No, nothing like that. I visit a lot of houses. It's my job. Every time I walk into a building, I get a feeling for the place. Places have feelings. Do you know what I mean? Carl died not long after that night. He was riding his bike through London when he was hit by a heavy goods vehicle. It was on the local news. The driver of the truck just didn't see him. Just like that, he was gone. At his funeral, I couldn't stop thinking about his experience in Japan. I wondered if it was a psychological thing, a reaction to being alone for long periods of time. I've also wondered Carl was right, and if it was something that had attached itself to him, an entity that was pushing him out of that place to send him home. If this were the case, it was a pretty clumsy way of communicating. Or perhaps, and this is the most dreadful thought, it was an entity that genuinely wanted to do him harm. As his coffin was slowly lowered into the ground, I looked at his wife and 2 children. I felt infinitely sad for them. The children were crying, but his wife was stone-faced with grief. As I looked at her, she slowly lifted her right hand and placed it gently at her throat. She held it there. A tear ran down her cheek.